In the year 399 BC, a Greek court tried the philosopher Socrates for crimes against the state. The 70-year-old was found guilty of introducing new gods and corrupting the young. He was forced to drink poison. The city which sentenced him to death wasn't a tyranny or a totalitarian regime. It was a democracy, one of the first democracies and certainly the most vigorous of all time. So how can it be that Athens, the city which created the concept of freedom of speech, should vote to kill one of its wisest citizens simply for speaking his mind freely? In the second part of this series, we'll see how Socrates pushed democratic liberty to its limits and was destroyed. I'll explore Athens in its golden age, home to great artists, philosophers and scientists, but also tearing itself apart from within. Could it be the very things that made democratic Athens great also held the seeds of its destruction? At the end of the 6th century BC, the Greek city of Athens took a dramatic step in the history of mankind. The aristocracy handed over power to the people.
They said, why don't we try something extraordinary? We can rule ourselves.
This grand experiment in popular rule lasted for just over a century.
This we take to be a ballot box.
The ordinary men of the city got to make every political decision themselves.
Say fost demosia, which means public vote.
It's absolutely unparalleled in world history.
5th century Athens is the place where most of our central ideas are put in place. Our ideas of Western culture, words like democracy, like theatre, and the whole principles of the legal system. These are an inheritance from Greece. If we want to understand where ideas have come from, we have to go back there.
But the Athenian experiment was hardly a utopia, some kind of progressive wonderland. While men were newly empowered, slaves and women remained oppressed.
All the evidence of vase paintings suggests that the woman is veiled in that she has her cloak draped over her head.
The Athenian Democrats repeatedly voted to go to war. They amassed a vast empire, forcing whole populations to become refugees.
The Athenians take overseas territories, dividing them democratically among themselves. And that was essentially what exporting democracy meant.
So is our image of Athens benign, high-minded, a solid bedrock for Western civilization? Is all this just a bit rose-tinted? In 438 BC, the Parthenon was finally completed, and Athens was flying high. The Athenian democracy had amassed the largest empire Greece had ever seen. Over 150 states from North Africa to the Crimea handed over vast sums to the Athenian treasury, which paid for a navy which roamed the seas unopposed. These ships were not for show. In its golden age, there were no 2 years when Athenian citizens did not vote to go to war. Its ruinous conflict with the Spartans, the Peloponnesian War, was to be the backdrop for all its high achievement.
This war is such an abysmal milestone in the history of civilization. Massacres, killing all the males, enslaving the women and children. This becomes standard practice in the Peloponnesian War. This is a new and terrible mode of warfare for the Greeks.
But amongst all this conflict, from every corner of the empire, a stream of artists, architects and philosophers flooded into the city, bringing with them new experiences, new ideas.
There's a real sea change in how people thought about what they were doing. Instead of just doing what we were doing before, we could now think about it. And that led to experimentation. And that idea that you could experiment is what makes democracy and the Enlightenment go together. That sense of ceaseless experimentation and thought.
This bronze of a Greek god is one of the most celebrated artefacts of the ancient world. And I think one of the reasons is because despite his antiquity, he looks like us. The stiff and formal figures that the Greeks had learnt from the artists of Egypt began to disappear as a more realistic style emerged. It's been called the Greek miracle, but there's new evidence to suggest that the change in style was accompanied by an innovative technique, casting from life.
Nobody has ever got it to look quite so lifelike. I think if you then put some clay just around it.
Sculptor Nigel Constant believes they used live models.
So you think that in the workshops of the famous sculptors of the day, they had models and they covered them in plaster in order to get a cast from life, is that right?
That's right. In high classical times, they were using life casts. There's no other explanation.
Why do you think it is that the experts don't want to believe your theory?
Well, I think nearly everyone regards him as the greatest sculptors ever. And to show that it was arrived at by this rather simple method, it's painful.
Nigel's been sculpting for 40 years, and when he studied the soles of the feet of the 5th century bronzes, he recognised the telltale signs of a sculptor's trick, something many art historians had missed.
In all the Greek bronzes that have survived, you get the sole of the foot distorted by pressure of the body on the foot. They're very naturalistic, not at all the way somebody would carve. There's only one way you can get that, and that is casting.
Live human models were copied in plaster.
We will take this mould off, assemble that, and we pour wax in. The important thing is this bit here. The shapes of the toes show weight upon it.
Do you think that why they're doing it is because they are trying to achieve absolute human perfection?
Yes, I think so.
Although it looks a bit disgusting.
In Athens, experimentation wasn't only limited to the arts. This is the place where some of our most fundamental scientific theories were debated and honed. Natural philosophers wanted to explore the basic matter of the universe. The invention of the optical microscope was over 2,000 years away. And yet without the microscope, the Greeks came up with the idea of an irreducibly small particle, and they gave it a name meaning indivisible, atomos, atom.
It's just astonishing to me that they were able to think in that really abstract way. Things like what is matter made of, and the idea of atoms. Of course, it's taken us until the last decade or so until we could actually isolate and visualize individual atoms as we can here.
Scientifically, that's difficult to do.
It's completely cutting edge. It's right at the limit of what we can technologically do today.
At last, atoms can be seen in the light of a laser, in a vacuum. The Greeks couldn't see atoms, but they could imagine them.
To come up with the ideas in the first place, that's the power of Greek thought. To have the ideas that there are out there laws of nature that we could perhaps discover by doing experiments and thinking about them, rather than just saying, well, this happens, this apple falls to the ground when I drop it because God says so, or there's some God which is putting the stars in the sky. They made a pretty good estimate of the distance to the moon, but they even were thinking about how far away the stars must be.
While art and science pushed ahead, the most radical advances were being made in pure thought. No one personifies the breakthrough in ideas more than Socrates, the most influential philosopher in the Western world. Born the son of a midwife and a stonemason, Socrates was in most respects a completely ordinary Athenian citizen. He served in the infantry, took his turn as a city official. He didn't write great works or open a philosophical school. But he did gain influence with aristocrats, whose sons competed for entry to his circle. Socrates was a fantastically original thinker. Central to his view of the world was the idea that each man should pursue his individual path to truth and to the good life. In fact, a lot of Socrates' ideas struck right at the heart of confident, ballsy, democratic Athens. He kept on asking these really irritating questions like, does wealth really make you happy? In an open society, why do we keep on needing to build city walls? Much of what Socrates had to say was simply not what the bulk of Athenians wanted to hear.
He must have cut a strange figure in a city that made a cult of the beautiful, famously ugly. He rarely washed or wore shoes. He'd have been a familiar sight, striding along in his threadbare cloak, surrounded by bright young men, eager to hear his novel ideas. When he met anyone who was renowned as an expert, he set about asking them questions, and in the process invented an entirely new method of rational inquiry.
Do you know what the difference is between good and evil?
Yes, goodness is what the gods love, and evil is what they hate.
But there are different gods. They don't always agree.
That's true.
So they love and hate different things.
Yes.
That would mean that some things were both loved and hated by the gods. So some things are both good and evil.
I suppose it would.
Well then, it looks like you haven't really answered my questions, have you?
No.
For most of the people he went up to, he asked questions that made them feel humiliated, ignorant, and uncomfortable.
He famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Socrates' method of philosophy may seem familiar to us, but at the time it was breathtakingly new. It laid the foundation of our belief that all things can be questioned. But it would earn him as many enemies as friends. Socrates' unsettling questions were to trouble not merely its citizens, but Athenian democracy itself. The 5th century BC saw an explosion in new scientific ideas all around Greece. Philosophers started to develop theories of how the world was made up of atoms and elements, how diseases could be cured, how societies ordered. A new breed, historians, sought to document, not decorate, events. They called it rational inquiry. But rationalism competed with an older worldview, one dominated by the gods, which Athenians learnt as children from epic poems and myths.
The Greeks all knew the stories. They knew that the gods and goddesses lived on Mount Olympus, where they squabbled and drank and had affairs with each other. But they also knew that they physically inhabited sacred patches of earth. And so they started to build for them monumental stone temples, earthly palaces for the god tribe. At the time, even wealthy men lived in mud brick structures.
The spirit world was honoured with opulence, for religion was supreme. These gorgeous, gigantic structures have come to resemble the essence of Greek culture. They seem solid, confident, robust. But just because the temples have lasted, we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that Greek religious life was all about grand gestures in monumental stone.
In one way, you get a better sense of the real ritual experience of the Athenians if you come down here late at night. This whole side of the rock was dedicated to the goddess Aphrodite, and men and women would continually come here to leave offerings in specially carved niches. During one festival, young virgins would clamber down through the rock of the Acropolis itself, down this staircase, which was carved back in the Bronze Age. They carried, what we were told, were baskets of unspeakable offerings. And they would stay here all night to worship the goddess.
Encouraging women to worship Aphrodite had an interesting political use.
Aphrodite is the goddess of sexual love, but she's also the goddess of persuasion and harmony. In a political system where there were so many players, each with vested interests, harmony was vital. And by worshipping Aphrodite, it was thought that women could entice this cosmic glue out of the goddess. In ancient Greek, there is no separate word for religion. Ritual was just part and parcel of everyday life and the political process. Gods and demigods were thought to walk the streets and be around every corner. But unfortunately, these were often malevolent spirits who demanded appeasement.
Recent excavations show that black magic, too, was at the heart of the Greeks' famously just and rational judicial system. In the main cemetery of Athens, the Kerameikos, underground wells and cisterns have yielded hundreds of curse tablets.
This poor chap's had his hands tied behind his back and he's been sealed in a lead coffin. And we know his name because on the lid of the coffin there's a very crude inscription that reads Mne Symmachos and all his cronies in the legal case. So whoever commissioned this was prosecuting Mne Symmachos and hoped that by creating this thing he could appropriate some kind of supernatural power so that the outcome of the law case was favourable to him. There are many of these things. So clearly this kind of magic was an unofficial but an integral part of the Athenian judicial system.
Scholars have often struggled with Greek religion. It doesn't square easily with the Athens they wanted to see, that was sophisticated and rational. Athens might have been a democracy, but it had emerged from an archaic world of multiple gods and primordial rituals. For the Athenians, there was one particular festival they cherished, which fostered a sense of togetherness. It was known as the Mysteries. The ritual started with a procession from the Kerameikos cemetery all along the sacred way. For years, it's been virtually impossible to work out what went on because this was a mystery religion, and initiates to the cult were bound by an oath of silence. The secret rituals promised hope of a happy afterlife.
The men and women arrived at Eleusis in time for the nocturnal celebrations. You have to try to imagine what it must have been like for them to be here. Approaching the sanctuary, they passed a cave, which was thought to be the entrance to the underworld itself.
Hades, the god of the underworld, had raped and abducted the goddess Demeter's daughter, Persephone. The ritual torch procession was to console the goddess for the loss of her child. Demeter could have her daughter back, but only for 8 months of the year. The myth was an allegory for the cycle of nature, the death of crops in the autumn and their magical rebirth in the spring. To the initiates, it must also have meant a promise of their own rebirth after death.
There'd been the smell of smoke from thousands of pine torches. Then you arrived here at the gates to the sanctuary. In fact, you can see how heavy they were from these ruts, where the doors were dragged open so that the thousands of cult followers could make their way into the sacred space. Athens jealously guarded admission to the mysteries, and the citizens of wartime opponents were excluded. Those who revealed the secret rites risked the death penalty.
Any attempt to divulge the secrets of the cult was considered an attack on democracy itself.
Michael Kosmopoulos has been the chief archaeologist here at Eleusis and has studied Greek ideas of the afterlife.
This fear of death, progressively it gets more and more intense. The reasons for this have to do probably with the emergence of the individual as a separate unit within democratic city-states, especially Athens.
What you're saying is that as you get more of a sense of yourself in the democratic system, that's when you can really start to address what happens to you after you die.
Yes, you start wondering about the big issues of life and death. And it is here at Eleusis that people try to find some answers for the first time. There is no heaven or hell. The world of the dead is this place without hope, without joy. Mystery cults has offered a hope at getting a better afterlife. And perhaps even finding your way to the Elysian fields, the closest that Greek religion comes to a notion of paradise.
So what would have happened to the initiates once they arrived here?
Well, they would line up right there at the end of the sacred way. Each person would come into the temple. And as you can see, this whole building is basically a huge theater.
Yeah.
The doors would lock, and that was the beginning of the ritual. Most scholars agree it was a reenactment of the actual myth of the abduction of Persephone by Hades and her final reunion with her mother Demeter. When we watch a play or a movie, we identify with the personalities. Persephone has gone to the underworld and she has returned. It's like your best friend has defeated death. Therefore, you draw strength and courage from that victory, so you don't fear death. This was as close as the Greeks would come to virtual reality, in the sense that they would simulate death in ritual.
Like us, the Athenians struggled with insoluble moral debates, and they chose to play these out in public and invented a new art form in order to do so.
Drama gives us an insight into what the Greeks thought about life overall, because they lived their lives in a very strict, logical, well-structured society. And when you live in that kind of society, some of your passions and feelings are suppressed. So by celebrating, they were allowed to have an outlet for these passions and feelings that they suppressed for the rest of the year.
The dramas dealt with horrific extremes of behaviour, sons raping mothers, brothers and sisters making love, mothers eating their children. All the dreadful potential of man was laid bare here. And a constant theme was the pursuit of power. Playwrights made it quite clear that even a democracy couldn't quench the ambitions of ruthless individuals. At almost exactly the same moment as the creation of democracy, something radical happened. One man stepped out of the chorus to take centre stage. One actor became two, two became three. Drama was born.
I think it's better than religion. I think tragedy is one of the great inventions of all time.
At Delphi, the poet Tony Harrison explains his take on Greek tragedy.
Just as some people need religion to answer the questions of what we suffer from, it was an important part of their politics, their culture, their debate. Certainly they don't separate art and culture in the way that we do, for something to do in the evening.
The theatrical performances were during the day, weren't they?
Very important to remember that they were done in the full light of day. They brought these things to the light of day, Istophos, to the light. If you're in the darkness, how could you bear such dark subject matter?
The tragedies, most of them are written at the time of the Peloponnesian War. Are we seeing any of that terrible, real historical time reflected back into the drama?
But we do get terrible stories of war in, for example, Euripides' Hecuba.
In the play, the Greeks are debating whether to sacrifice a young girl to glorify the dead warrior Achilles.
The people who are most eloquent in debating for sacrificing her are Athenians, so undermining their own democracy by having a democratic act to kill an innocent.
Yeah, and it can be a true horror of democracy that the mass of people can vote for something which is appalling.
What followed after was will clash and conflict, welling and surging through the whole summoned army, some for the sacrifice and others against. The sons of Theseus, both bred in Athens, made separate speeches, but were of the same mind, that the grave mound of Achilles be given its crown of glory, a fresh gore garland from a green girl. It's all the language of democratic voting used to sacrifice an innocent girl. The same language you needed for the persuasion in the law courts and the assembly. At the end of the war, I think when I was 8, I saw a terrible film of them bulldozing bodies in Belsen, and it really went into my soul, and I thought, well, how can you find ways to express the terrors of our own time? And then I discovered this great theatre of light and this style to express darkness. And I always think of, when I'm here in Delphi, I always go and touch these stones down here on the polygonal wall, because that for me is a metaphor for tragedy. It was built with all these strange shapes that when the earthquake came, they would lock. They wouldn't fall down like regular bricks. They would lock together more tightly. And this, for me, is like the verse of tragedy containing and surviving the earthquake of dark emotion.
Because those blocks have all they're inscribed, aren't they?
And they're inscribed. The wonderful thing is that you can see letters joining them together. And I always think it's really the words that hold everything up.
When you hear the words of Greek tragedy, you don't get the impression of a culture that is calm and robust. This feels like a society in turmoil, somewhere that is at once immensely confident and immensely insecure.
That tension runs all the way through Athenian society. So in some ways we have this great intellectual explosion of we are now scientists, we can now progress. And all the time, Greek tragedy, a new genre, new trendy literature, is reminding us, no, you can't. Like Oedipus, you're going to find out that actually, when you thought you were in control, you've been sleeping with your mother, you killed your father, your life has been one big sham. The person who thinks he has the answer is the person who's leading himself into tragedy.
And now Athens too was courting tragedy. 5th century Athens was transforming herself. But new ideas were setting her on a collision course with tradition.
While builders were widening this road, they came across something they were not expecting to find. 3 aristocratic graves in pristine condition.
When archaeologists came here the next day to investigate, they were astounded. They described this tomb as being suffocatingly full of artifacts. There was gold and bronze and alabaster perfume jars. But in fact, it was up here on the top of the tomb, in the charred remains of the funeral pyre, that the greatest treasure would appear.
The tomb was clearly of a wealthy aristocrat, someone who could afford such elaborately decorated artifacts. Amongst the riches of the tombs, the fragments of burnt papyrus turned out to be the oldest surviving book in Europe.
These words have been burnt, scattered on top of a tomb and buried in the earth for 2,400 years. So it is close to miraculous that they've survived at all. In this little fragment here, we learn that Zeus has raped his mother, who then goes on to give birth to Aphrodite. So you can just see Aphrodite.
The scrolls took years to decipher, but ideas contained in the writing presented a remarkable puzzle. Dirk Obbink was the first scholar outside Greece to see the scrolls. At the Oxford Papyrology Institute, he uses spectral scanning to decipher the text using different wavelengths of light.
When we took it down deep in the infrared spectrum, most of the color disappears, but you get great contrast between the dark background and only slightly darker ink. An entire line of writing was produced. That section was so dark that to the naked eye, it wasn't even read. It shows what multispectral imaging is able to do with a difficult-to-read text.
The Devaney papyrus presented special problems because it had been rolled up in a scroll.
But as with the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's taken a long time just to figure out what author was talking about.
The author is commenting on a religious text. He tells us we shouldn't understand the myths literally, but interpret them scientifically.
The author gives an analysis of a piece of religious poetry, but he thinks it mustn't be taken literally, it has to be taken allegorically, and when he analyzes it, he's presenting the view that it's actually an account of the creation of the world in terms of the current theory of molecular science, which is a truly extraordinary mode of interpretation. And the kind of thing you might find in the 18th century when Newton was reinterpreting the Bible as showing the latest physics. This scientist thinks that the universe always existed, has no beginning or end.
That's why it's so exciting, though, isn't it? Because this is the touch paper at the moment that it's being lit.
This is the origins of modern science. It gives us an insight into a period when the Greeks were speculating about the origins of the universe.
These theories are incredibly dangerous. In 414, the author Diagoras of Milos, a friend of Socrates, was charged with impiety. The democracy put a price on his head and demanded that he be assassinated without trial, almost certainly because he dared to write this. Diagoras fled the city.
Thinkers like Diagoras were becoming the target of suspicion and persecution because of their ability to mislead the people. Intellectuals and aristocrats would meet behind closed doors and discuss unorthodox ideas at the infamous symposium.
That's one of the very peculiar things about the Athenian democracy. It's suspicion of any groups of people getting together. It's hatred of cliques, because they could all be against the democracy.
James Davidson has studied the symposium and the various power groups within Athenian society.
The Greek symposium is really a group of men who are all drinking together in a very small room. So it's a very intimate kind of environment. The symposium is supposed to be off-duty. They're in a relaxed situation. And you're not supposed to be talking about politics either. This is not a debating chamber. But underneath all of that, this is a way for people to establish links. So politics keeps on creeping in through the back door.
The symposium was rich with homosexual overtones, but the erotic dalliances were often a cover for secret networking.
Is the homosexual relationship to do with power and status as well as sex?
I think it's more to do with male bonding. I know that sounds fairly obvious, but we very often find that there's a great anxiety about how the beloved is really in it for a political position, when the admira is really in it to have a little client or a little agent who will help him.
It was at the symposium that Socrates drank with and inspired the most powerful of the aristocrats. He was the dazzling young general Alcibiades. The fame of an Olympic victory had propelled him into the limelight. Overnight, he'd become Athens' most charismatic and influential politician. At exactly this time, Plato tells us, Socrates and Alcibiades were to be found together at a famous symposium. Socrates reveals to Alcibiades and the other guests the mysteries of love. It's a clever adaptation of the mysteries of Eleusis. Its language, which mixes religion and science, is reminiscent of the Devaney papyrus.
The ideas appeared radical, Alcibiades and others were engaged in private celebrations that seemed to some people to be actually mocking the Eleusinian mysteries. And the Daveni papyrus could also well have been seen in some circles to have been mocking or trying to displace the traditional mysteries.
But what had remained in private was about to erupt in public and shatter the career of Alcibiades and the fortunes of Athens. In 415, Alcibiades was riding a wave of public popularity. He persuaded the Athenians to enlarge the empire and conquer Sicily. But even before the expedition set off, something shocking happened. A religious scandal. Across Athens, at every street corner, were statues, representations of Hermes, the messenger god. The morning after they decided to sail for Sicily, the Athenians woke up to find hundreds of these statues mutilated, with their noses and erect phalluses cut off.
An investigation was launched, and witnesses started to come forward with information about the nocturnal antics of groups of aristocratic young men, debauched dinner parties in which the gods were mocked, and all whispered that Alcibiades was the ringleader. Once the fleet had arrived at Sicily, a boat was sent from Athens to bring Alcibiades back for trial.
But Alcibiades escaped. He was now in Sparta, advising the enemy on how to defeat Athens. Now, that really was a bad omen.
When it came to assaults on their religion, the Athenians were in a very ugly mood. They started a witch hunt. Of course, first for the people who had smashed the statues, but secondly for people who had been alleged to parody the Eleusinian mysteries. And the Athenians revoked the prohibition on citizens being tortured, and a lot of people were tortured and executed. It was a truly terrible time in the city.
Things were looking very bad for Socrates. His most famous protege had become a national pariah, and all around him his fellow intellectuals were being brought to trial. The scene was set for Socrates' own tragic drama. The last decades of the 5th century BC saw the end of the golden age of Athens, as her internal divisions were punished on a massive scale by the might of her foreign enemies. In just 15 years, the democracy itself would crumble. In the year 413 BC, Athens had been at war for almost 20 years with Sparta. Athens' great hope of ending the war had been the brilliant young general Alcibiades, now in disgrace. Two years after the voyage to Sicily, the Athenian force, shorn of its greatest general, found itself trapped in the harbour at Syracuse. Her enemies closed in. The Athenians were annihilated.
The few survivors started to limp back to the city. The stories they brought with them were so horrific that at first the Athenians refused to believe them. And then, when they realised that these things were true, panic swept through the city.
After Sicily, things went from bad to worse for Athens. Inside the city, there was political turmoil. The citizens looked for people to blame, persecuting the talented leaders and thinkers who'd once been the democracy's lifeblood.
A system that had harnessed the competitive instincts of the aristocrats for the benefit of the people had turned into a regime that drove Athens' finest into the hands of its enemies.
Democracy was fatally wounded. Death squads roamed the streets. And in this climate of fear, the Athenians turned on Socrates.
For over half a century, Socrates had roamed through Athens, goading the city like a gadfly with his interminable questions. And while the democracy was strong, the Athenians had viewed him with interest. He was a bit of an eccentric. But after the horrors of the last few years, he was viewed as a destabilizing influence that had to be permanently eradicated.
Socrates was brought to trial on 2 counts: for mocking the gods the city believed in and for corrupting its youth.
A couple of Socrates' former pupils turned out to be traitors and anti-democrats, and so they saddled Socrates with the responsibility for that. The Athenians always believed that people should be held responsible for whatever views they expressed.
The accusations were put to him in the Agora, where he was summoned to appear before the chief magistrate. The quarter is now severed by the Athens metro.
According to Plato, Socrates says he has to stop taking part in the dialogues because he has to go to this building here in order to answer the charge.
John Camp's been excavating the Agora for nearly 40 years.
How would it have been organised here, and who would have been involved?
Well, the Athenians are very litigious people, so the courts would have met frequently, and there were lots of them. And they took huge manpower because the smallest Athenian jury is 201. 501 is common, 1,501 if they really wanted to. It was very loud and very noisy and very crowded all the time.
The trial of Socrates was a most extraordinary occasion. Socrates was utterly uncompromising. The thing I'm not going to do, he says, is to give up philosophizing, to give up talking to people, asking people what it is that they believe in. Clearly, there was quite a lot of heckling.
Plato reports that Socrates scorned his accusers. They fall back on the stock charges against any seeker of wisdom, that he teaches his pupils about things in the heavens and below the earth, to disbelieve in the gods, and to make the weaker argument defeat the stronger. They would be very loath, I fancy, to admit the truth, which is that they are pretending to knowledge, when in fact they are entirely ignorant. He refused throughout to respect the court. Asked to suggest a punishment when the jurors might well have accepted exile, he answered, "Free meals for life," the traditional reward for sporting heroes.
He'd always told them the truth, what was good for them, and therefore they ought to thank him. And that's not quite how they saw it. And so when he suggested he should be treated as the equivalent of an Olympic victor, which was the most heroic human being around, that didn't go down well. As it was, more jurors voted yes, he should be executed than had voted yes, he's guilty. Some changed their minds, in other words.
Plato tells us that Socrates made sure he had the final word. The hour of departure has arrived, and we both go our own ways. I to die, and you to live. Which is better? God only knows.
It may have been here that Socrates spent his last days, in the small prison in the Athenian Agora. On the allotted day, he drank hemlock from a tiny cup. He walked around until his legs grew heavy. He lay down on his bed. Plato was clearly moved. This was the end of our comrade, a man who was best, wisest, and most just of all. But death by hemlock was agonizing. Socrates would have been consumed by pain, vomiting, and diarrhea.
Almost immediately, the Athenians regretted what they'd done. They voted to erect a statue of Socrates just outside the city walls. And Plato, his pupil, would go on to write him into history as the world's first ideological martyr.
a martyr to liberty and freedom of speech.
He told the Athenians things they didn't want to hear about themselves, and he refused to make any concessions. That's, of course, one of the reasons he's so admirable, but also one of the reasons he was executed.
Socrates was seen as the educator of tyrants. It would be better to think of him perhaps in those terms as somebody giving a hate speech in a mosque. Would we allow free speech under such terms? Teachers have responsibility. They should live up to the responsibility. And Socrates certainly was productive of some of the most dangerous men in Athens in the 5th and 4th century. And one should never forget that his most important pupil, Plato, was the theorist to whom Stalin turned and Hitler turned in order to justify their totalitarian state. There is something of a blackness in that philosophy.
Socrates questioned the wisdom of mass rule. He allied himself to the gung-ho conservative aristocrats. He was, in many ways, anti-democratic. But at the same time, his questions liberated mankind. He was a pioneer in a movement which had begun to reach beyond the confines of religion and ask questions about how the world was made and what the role of humans was within that world. Democracy could tolerate many things, but not a direct challenge to democracy itself. By questioning the gods, Socrates had undermined the shared value system upon which Democratia depended. The paradox is that these radical ideas developed precisely because Athenian democracy allowed free speech. Direct Athenian democracy only lasted for 150 years. Although we uphold it as the pillar of our civilization, in fact, the West has spent much of its history rejecting it as a political model. The story of Athens goes part of the way to explain why. Democracy is hard work. It is demanding and flawed and volatile. For 3 generations, Athens had been phenomenally successful. The citizens of the polis had lived through one of the most radical and innovative histories of the world. Yes, it was fickle and inconsistent and sometimes vindictive, but we have to admit to ourselves that those are the hallmarks of an open society. If you empower people, you sign up to a life of uncertainty and change. And nowhere demonstrates that better than the bloody and brilliant place that was democratic Athens.